So probably the single biggest talking point since the announcement of Battlefield 6 has been its open versus locked weapons debate that is still raging on within the community. It's clearly divided most of us, and I still see so many creators or players on Reddit that are still giving really strong opinions on it. And so today I thought I'd weigh in with my own thoughts, as I'm not going to lie, it is a pretty fun topic to discuss. I'm going to go through the pros and the cons to each of these different systems and try and break all of it down for you guys, at least from my perspective anyway, before I then weigh in at the end with my own take on which I think is the best. And so without wasting any time, let's get stuck right into it. Now we're going to start off with the locked weapons system, just because that is, I guess, the OG, that's the one that we're all used to. And then after that, I'll get into the open weapon system. Now starting off with the pros for the locked weapons, the simplest one here, and the one that is very hard to argue against, is simply the fact that it has worked in every Battlefield game prior to 2042, which ironically is seen as the worst Battlefield game that there is, and it was the first to introduce open weapons. And so it worked in all of those previous Battlefield titles. No one really complained about it back then. It is proven to work. And so it goes back to that old adage of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think something else that should be in the pros list as well is that it does really add to the strong role identity that you get from each class. Now, as an example, in previous games, if you picked the Recon class, that does generally mean that you need to play a little bit slower. You're generally going to have a sniper. I know you could still run SMGs and certain weapons in, for example, Battlefield 4, but for the most part, you were playing with a sniper, and it meant that you do need to play a little bit slower unless you're an absolute freak with a sniper and you can get up close and personal. But I think for most people, playing Recon kind of goes hand in hand with playing a little bit stealthier, a little bit slower, and that really doubles down on the identity of that class. As another example, whenever you pick Engineer, that generally allows you to play very aggressively, being up on the front lines with an SMG and trying to get close to those vehicles to take them out. And so in those previous games where the locked weapons was the way that it worked, I do think that although the classes already have identity through the gadgets and how they play in that sense, I think that the weapons almost doubled down on that, and it made the classes feel very defined and gave you a very strong role with each class that you picked. Lastly, for the pros, I think this is also pretty damn important, is that there were slightly less prevalent metas compared to having it with open weapons, or for example games like Call of Duty where there's not even classes and everyone just can pick whatever weapon they want. In games like Call of Duty and even in 2042, having them all open, it does result in generally maybe 1 to 3 weapons being objectively the best, and pretty much everyone uses them. And although you can't blame people for using the best weapons, it can get a little bit stale, it can get a little bit frustrating dying to the same weapon over and over again. And that is something that definitely is slightly reduced when it comes to the locked weapons, where yes, there were always still metas, there were always still the best guns in the game, but I think it was a little bit more spread out, because if you wanted to play as a different class, well, you can't use that weapon anymore. And I think that is definitely a pro, which has been kind of amplified over the last few years as a negative, where games like Call of Duty, and especially in like Warzone, for example, there is generally just like the meta weapon that every single person uses, and it can be very, very frustrating. Now, getting into the cons for the locked weapon system, there are also a fair few in here that, again, back in the day, I don't think really anyone complained about, but now that they're toying with the open versus locked weapons debate, I think these are definitely things worth mentioning. Now, first and foremost, and I think this is why they have tried to actually change this in the last few games, is that a lot of people do just pick the class for the weapon, not for the role itself. And that can be really frustrating if you're getting a lot of players in your team who are medics, but they're playing as a medic just to use the SMG, for example, in the game like Battlefield 5, where those weapons were generally some of the best in the game. You get a lot of people who are playing medic and they're not actually reviving, they're not healing anyone, they're just focused on themselves, and they are just healing themselves and using the best weapons, but they're not playing the role as it's actually intended. And I think that is a big part of why they've actually tried to implement this, because now you can choose the role that you want and still just use whatever weapon, and it does reduce that issue where people were just straight up picking the class, not for the class itself, but for the weapon instead. There's also the downside when it is locked that you might want to use a certain weapon. Maybe you've got a favorite gun and it goes really well with the map you're playing on, for example, but maybe no one in your squad is playing as a medic, everyone's playing assault, they're just picking the class just for the weapon, but someone on your team needs to be a medic, and so you kind of go, okay, well, I'm going to have to play as a medic, but therefore I have to change weapon, and now I'm objectively just not going to do as well, or I'm not going to have as much fun because I don't get to use the weapon that I went into the game wanting to use. Or on the flip side, you just don't do that and you keep using the weapon that you want, and now your team still just doesn't have a medic, and that does throw off the team balancing quite a bit. So there is still that downside to it as well, where sometimes you do just have to bite the bullet and go, okay, well, no one's playing as a medic or support or whatever you want to call it. No one's playing as engineer and there are tanks dominating. I'm going to have to switch class, but now that means I don't get to use my favorite gun, and that can result to a less enjoyable experience and even just not playing as well, which then in turn, if you've picked engineer to take out the tanks, but you're dying because you don't have a good weapon, then you're actually no help to the team at all. You can't take out the tank if you're constantly dying because the gun you're using isn't as good as what you usually like to use. Another issue, in my opinion, with the locked weapon system is that if weapons kind of suck in a certain class, so let's just say as an example, this is very much not the case in Battlefield 6, but let's just say as an example, the SMGs were really bad and the assault rifles were just so much better in every way, that massively nerfs the engineer class because no one's going to want to use an objectively worse weapon, and therefore either A, your engineers are going to suck, they're going to constantly be dying like I just said, or B, no one's going to play engineer and therefore the tanks on the other team are going to absolutely dominate. So again, the balancing is very much tied to the classes, and it can result in some very big power dynamics where one class is just absolutely dominant and the rest can be terrible, and I personally do think that that is a pretty big issue. Lastly, for the cons, and this is a bit of a smaller thing because I think most of us watching this are probably Battlefield veterans, so let's be honest here, we don't really care. But when it comes to new player onboarding, as in people coming from other franchises, or maybe this is their very first shooter or whatever the case may be, if the weapons are locked, it can be a little bit harder for newer players to kind of get into the feel of the game. They don't know what class they want to use, they don't know what weapon they want to use, and I think that having them open is a little bit easier for newer players to be able to use any combination that they want and feel as comfortable as they can, considering there is so much to learn when it comes to playing Battlefield. Now, before we get on to the open weapon system, if you guys are new to the channel and you are interested in more Battlefield 6 content, be sure to hit that subscribe button because there is so much more content on the way, both in the lead up to launch and obviously plenty more after launch too, so make sure you don't miss out. Now, moving on to the open weapon system, the current iteration, I guess you would say, and starting off with the pros, the most important thing for me is simply player freedom. That is, to me, what Battlefield is kind of all about. They always go on about Battlefield being a sandbox game, and it very much is that. It is the type of game where you're kind of meant to be able to play however you want. If you want to just run around healing people, you can do that. If you want to run around sniping people, you can do that. If you want to just be a tank player, you can do that. And if you want to just play as an engineer and take out tanks, you can also do that as well. So that is kind of what Battlefield has always been about, in my opinion. It's a game that, although yes, there are very clear objectives and there are roles that are defined for us, it has always been about player freedom and just allowing us to have fun in whatever way we want. And to me, the open weapon system just adds to that even further. Another pro, which is kind of a counterpoint to one of the pros I mentioned for the locked weapons, is that this actually gives a bit more versatility within the classes. So as an example, if you choose the support class, but you have a bunch of different weapon types to choose from, it actually allows you to play as multiple different types of support, if that makes sense. So as one example, you could run around with an SMG as that really aggressive, like frontline medic, getting up right near the objectives, throwing down smoke, reviving your teammates who are right there on the objective, and that might not be possible with an LMG or with an assault rifle compared to using an SMG or a shotgun, for example. But then you can also play the more, I guess, realistic medic, where generally medics aren't like right on the front line in a real war. Their job is to help heal people, essentially. And so you can play the more realistic role with like a DMR, where you're maybe sitting a little bit back, healing and reviving teammates who are defending from a distance, for example. And it means that you can play that medic role in multiple different ways, rather than you just have to have an LMG, and therefore you maybe have to be a bit slower and more cumbersome, not allowing you to play really aggressive, or even not allowing you to play at a little bit more range, because although LMGs have decent range, they're not as good as a DMR or a sniper, for example. The same thing goes for the engineer class, for example. You could also have your really aggressive engineers who are up on the front lines blowing up tanks, but you might also want to play as an engineer where you're sitting back a little bit. You've got people who are refilling your RPG ammo and you want to take out tanks from a distance so that they don't even have a chance to get close to the objective. And that is just as important of a playstyle as the really aggressive engineer as well. So I think that the versatility within the classes is just amplified when you have open weapons, and that's something that, at least for me personally, I see that as a pro. I think you also get a lot less people that are just picking classes just for the weapon. Now, if I want to play with an assault rifle, for example, I don't have to choose the assault class, which, to be honest, I definitely am not doing, because to me that class is borderline useless. So it is great that I can now play as, for example, a medic and actually use the weapon that I want, rather than if I just want to use an assault rifle, well, I can't play as a medic, I've got to go and play as the assault class, which I personally think isn't as helpful for the team. As the final pro, this is essentially what I just mentioned in the cons for the locked weapon system, is that it is just an easier onboarding for new players. Everyone can just use whatever gun they want in whatever class they want, and I do think that that is a lot easier for new players or more casual players to just pick whatever they want, rather than being really restricted to a specific role and a specific weapon. Now, moving on to the cons though for the open weapons, like I said earlier, this will lead to more prevalent metas in this game unless the balancing is absolutely impeccable, which I'll be honest, it is not going to be. And so I dare say that with the open weapon system, there will definitely be a lot of times, if not essentially the entire lifespan of the game, where 1 or 2 weapons, maybe 3 or 4 weapons will just be objectively the best, and no matter what class anyone's using, they will just default to those weapons, which, like I said, can get pretty damn annoying at times. I also think that even though I just kind of mentioned it as a pro, in terms of the versatility with the classes, it can also be seen as a con. It does result in slightly less defined roles, which, like I said, I don't really mind too much, but I can understand that some people dislike that, and I think that is a fair enough point. The final con I have here is that it does also feel just different to the old games, which I don't personally think matters hugely, but I do think that we all want familiarity. We all want the Battlefield 3, Battlefield 4 era of this game to kind of return, and for the franchise to go back to its roots. And so with a different system, that does feel a little bit less likely. It can still feel very much like Battlefield, but it's always going to feel that little bit different. And I think most of us anyway really do just want this game to kind of go back to its roots, which is kind of less likely with the open weapon system. So now that I've gone through the pros and cons, or at least my own pros and cons anyway, for each of the different systems, it is time to weigh in with my own opinion here. And I will be honest, in the lead up to the beta, and once they had announced they were going with the open weapons, you guys may have even seen, if you follow me on Twitter, I was like adamantly against open weapons. I was that guy pretty much saying, please revert it, we do not want open weapons. And I'm going to be completely honest with you guys, I have 100% swapped sides in the argument, and I am now adamantly for the open weapon system, which is pretty rare for me. I'm a pretty stubborn guy, and I generally don't change my opinion that easily, but I'm not going to lie, I am 100% of the opinion that the open weapon system is just better moving forward. One thing that I always see when it comes to this debate is a lot of people talking about class readability, saying that, as an example, I see an enemy and I can see that he's got an LMG, and so I know that's a support player. I know that they're going to be able to heal themselves and they're going to have smoke and all that sort of stuff. And while on paper, I do think that theory makes a lot of sense. If you see someone with an LMG, you can kind of download the information that is related to that class, and therefore that helps you out in the gunfight. And like I said, on paper, that works really well. In reality, I don't know about you guys, I have never once seen an enemy on my screen and the first thing I do is look at the weapon that they're using and therefore determine how I approach that gunfight. If I see an enemy on my screen, I am trying to kill them. I do not care if they're using an LMG, a fucking rocket launcher, or a pistol. If they are a threat to me, I'm going to shoot them. It doesn't matter what gun that they are using, at least in the lobbies that I'm in. I do not have time to sit there and calculate all the stuff that they have. I'm just simply trying to kill them. And so the whole thing of, well, if I see an LMG, I know what class it is, to me, that just doesn't really make sense. Now, of course, there are definitely situations where that can happen. So for example, maybe you shoot at an enemy and they just get to cover, and now it's a bit of a standoff, and having that extra information would be really helpful. If you know that that was an assault class, they're going to have a grenade launcher and you should probably get away from anywhere that they can hit you with the splash damage. If you know that that was a medic, you know they can heal themselves, and so you better get ready for when they re-peek that corner and they are no longer at half health, they're now fully healed up. Those bits bits of information are definitely helpful, don't get me wrong, but to me, that comes down more to the actual class readability in terms of the silhouette of the character, and simply looking at a character and telling immediately what that class is. That does not come down to the weapon for me personally. I've never once looked at a weapon in the middle of a gunfight and tried to determine what that class is. Half the time you can't tell what the weapon is because they're at a certain range where it just looks like a gun. I can't really tell what it is unless it's like a 50 cal sniper or an LMG where it's objectively bigger. But there's going to be times where you look at the character and you can't tell if it's an SMG or an assault rifle because it's not like you're standing there looking at their gun for like 10 seconds to actually see what it is. You'll see it for a split second and you cannot really tell what that weapon is most of the time. Or if you can, I'm going to be honest, you're probably dead by the time you've actually learned what the weapon is. So while on paper I do agree with that whole theory of if I see a guy with a sniper, I know that he's a recon class and then I know he's got C4, so I should be careful about the C4. I understand that on paper, but in reality, to me, that doesn't really happen. Maybe with the snipers being the exception to that, just because obviously snipers are very different. One, they're huge, and two, they give off the sniper glint, so that's maybe an exception. But with an LMG, they're not that much different looking in a lot of cases than an assault rifle. It's not that easy to tell at a quick glance. If you've got the time to actually look at the weapon, sure, but most of the time you do not have that time. If you sit there looking at their gun trying to figure out what it is, they're going to kill you before you even realize. So that whole argument of class readability, to me, that does not make any sense. If I see an enemy, I am going to try to kill them. If I can't kill them, maybe they're too far away, I've got an SMG or something, I'm going to reposition. I'm not going to sit there and learn about that class. I'm going to reposition, try and flank them. I'm going to try and do something to kill that enemy if they are an immediate threat to me. And I think that the whole weapon relating to class readability, to me, that just doesn't really make sense when you actually play it out in game. At the end of the day though, although I've just said I am adamantly of the opinion that the open weapon system is better, at the end of the day, I am fine with both. I'm picking a side here, but I really do not care. If they decided today, nah, we're deleting the open weapons, we're going back to closed weapons, you would not hear me complain. I simply do not care, because to me, it changes the game by about 2%. It doesn't actually make as big of a difference as I think most people make it out to be. I genuinely think if we reverted today, most people probably wouldn't even notice. So to me, it's not that big of a deal, even though I do have a pretty strong opinion on it now. I think either way is honestly completely fine. And I think that realistically, they should just include both like they've done. I will say they definitely need to allow the locked weapons to be a little bit more prevalent, because it seems like it is just a little afterthought now. I think it should be straight 50-50 if they're going to do that, rather than like all of the modes are just open, but then they've got one little tiny mode that's locked. I think it needs to be 50-50 to make it fair for everyone, but like I said, I personally think it just doesn't make as big of a difference as most people make it out to be. And I think now that the classes are more defined compared to 2042, that sort of fixes the issue. Because basing it on 2042, I do agree. That game did not have any class identity, and it felt at times like that was due to the open weapons, but I don't think it was. I think it was just straight up down to the specialists. And now that we've got an actual example where we've got really defined classes, but we have open weapons, I genuinely think that this is the way forward. I feel like the closed weapons is a little bit archaic in ways and a little bit restrictive despite it being great in the past. That's not that it was bad in the past. I just think that we have maybe moved past that now, and that's why I'm sort of the opinion that the open weapons is the way forward. But that has dragged on for a lot longer than I expected. I guess it is a topic that it is divisive and it is very interesting to discuss. So I'm keen to hear all of your thoughts down below. Be sure to leave a comment whether you agree or disagree with me, and leave your own reasons as to why, because I am keen to share in the discussion with you guys. But with that being said, thank you all very much for watching. You guys have a great day, and I'll see you all out there on the battlefield.